So we're going to start this new period in American history from 1800 to 1848 with Thomas Jefferson's administration, Roman numeral 1. The election of 1800, the reason AP starts a new time period at 1800 is because of the election of 1800. This election is one of the elections that we need to know throughout this class. There's going to be about 10 throughout the year. And the election of 1800 is known for two things. We'll start with the first thing. It's known for being a very, quote-unquote, dirty election. There's lots of mudslinging. It's Adams, who is the sitting Federalist president, versus Jefferson, who is the challenger as a Democratic Republican. These two men used to be best friends, but since they're now in different parties, they don't get along, and they have, in this election, they are going to do some personal attacks against each other. And so Adams, he says that Jefferson is a demagogue, which means that he's a panderer. He does anything, he says anything to get elected, and that's not something a gentleman at the time was supposed to do. Next, he accuses Jefferson of wanting to bring the French Revolution to America. If you remember from our previous lecture, the Democratic Republicans liked the French Revolution because it was a revolution of the common man who was going to overthrow the elite, and that's exactly what Jefferson wants to have happen in America. Maybe not so violently, but Jefferson creates fear and warns Americans that if Jefferson is elected, he's going to try to bring that violent revolution to the United States. Next, he claims that Thomas Jefferson wants to destroy the United States of America. Now, Jefferson doesn't want to do that, but Jefferson has promised that if he gets elected president, he is going to weaken the federal government. And so that's how Adams can claim that Jefferson is going to destroy the United States. Next, he says that he's an atheist. Don't elect Jefferson. He will make us not have any religion in America. And while Jefferson is probably a deist, which means he believes that there is a God, but he's not all that relevant. He just has started the universe and he creates the laws of gravity and motion. He then just kind of lets that run the universe. He certainly probably isn't an atheist. But for Adams, you're trying to win an election, and so he says, be afraid. And so, in fact, when Jefferson does win the election in 1800, there will be many Americans around the country who bury their Bibles in the backyard because they're afraid that Jefferson is going to come and steal them away. Next, Adams says that Jefferson robs widows and has illegitimate children. And these are partially true. Jefferson was in a court case that involved a widow, and he did take her money because of the case. And he does have illegitimate children with his slave Sally Hemings. But we can see that if we look at all of these charges from Adams to Jefferson, it certainly is becoming this political campaign is becoming very personal, and it's lots of mudslinging. Of course, Jefferson says that Adams is going to take away your freedom. 4 more years of Adams, we will not have any freedoms left in America, because during Adams's first term, he did sign the Alien and Sedition Acts that would limit immigration and also make it illegal to criticize the government. He also says that, Adams, even though he's not Hamilton, he believes in all of Hamilton's policies. And if you remember, farmers in America did not like Hamilton because he created the bank, he had tariffs, he forced people to use specie instead of paper money. And so when Jefferson brings up this thing, he says that Hamilton and Adams are just alike. He's trying to remind people that the Federalists are very anti-farmer. Next, he says, look, Adams raised taxes, so if you want 4 more years of taxes, vote for Adams. During Adams' administration, we had the pseudo-war, the pretend war with the French. We were getting ready for the war. He raised taxes. He created the Navy Department, the Marine Corps, and then we didn't have war. And so he said that, look, they took away your freedoms. The government took away your property, your money, and for no reason at all. And so Adams was foolishly telling people that we're going to get ready for war, and so he raised taxes and he didn't deliver. And then he says that Adams is an elitist, which is true. Adams is an elitist. He reminds all of these farmers that are about to go vote that if you want a Federalist as your president, they don't represent you. They only represent the East Coast elite, and they like England. They're Anglophiles, and do we really want a government from England here in America? Do we want that style again? And so we see these two men have very different personalities. They don't like each other personally, as we can see in some of these accusations, but also it's a very clear choice. If you're an East Coast elite who is very pro-business, you're going to vote for Adams. If you're a farmer who doesn't trust the strong national government, you're going to vote for Jefferson. So here we see some of our earliest political cartoons that we're going to talk about this year. On the left-hand side, we see Jefferson, and he has the Constitution in his hand, and he's reaching out and he's going to drop it into the altar and burn it, the altar of despotism, while God looks on, and we see an American symbol, liberty. This eagle is trying to stop him from destroying America. Of course, this is referencing the idea that Jefferson wants to destroy the federal government. It's too strong. We also see curled around the altar is a snake, and so we're reminding people that Jefferson is an atheist, so he must be a servant of Satan. On the right-hand side, it's very more deliberate, right? We see Jefferson, and he's pulling down the pillar of the government that George Washington and John Adams created, and the devil is helping him do this. So once again, these are cartoons from Federalists who are trying to remind people about all the accusations of Jefferson so they won't vote for him. But of course, Jefferson does win. He wins the election of 1800. I mean, as we can see here, when we get an election map, we divide it into sections. So between Pennsylvania and Maryland, that's the Mason-Dixon line, we see that the Federalists still do very well, and John Adams gets a lot of votes. And then we see below that line, we see it's almost all Democratic Republican, because the people who live south of the Mason-Dixon line are farmers. Then if we look in Kentucky and Tennessee out west, that always goes solidly Democratic Republican because they're farmers too. And Jefferson is saying that if you elect him, he's going to help farmers. The big reason, so it's a pretty close election, but the big reason that the Jeffersonians win is because they got New York. New York has 12 electoral votes, and in this election, it's a swing state, which means that however that state goes, that's who's going to win the election. And the reason Jefferson won this normally Federalist state is because he had Aaron Burr as his vice presidential candidate. Aaron Burr is from New York, and he was able to convince the people of New York that the Democratic Republicans, they have their back, that they will represent the interests of the people of New York. And so because of that, we're going to see Jefferson win because he won New York. Now, the election was kind of confusing, though, because if you remember, back in the election of 1796, we had the Constitution says that whoever wins the most amount of votes is the president, and the second amount of votes is the vice president. And so that meant that Adams was president, and his hated political enemy Jefferson was his vice president. And we realized that was probably a mistake. So we had changed the Constitution. But now we have another problem, is they said, okay, you can vote for people in pairs. And so people voted for Jefferson and Burr in a pair, and everybody was assuming that Jefferson was going to be the president, but it doesn't say that on the ballot. It didn't say Jefferson president, Aaron Burr vice president, and so technically both men had the same amount of votes. So this was confusing, and Aaron Burr, he took advantage of the situation. He knew that everybody really was thinking Jefferson as president, but he said, here's my opportunity. Let me go ahead and try to kind of steal the presidency from my friend Thomas Jefferson. And so eventually they worked it out. And they're going to change the Constitution, the 12th Amendment, as a result of this election. So there's another reason the election of 1800 is important. Not only is this a very personal, very partisan election, but it also is going to cause us to want to change the Constitution, to need to change the Constitution. And so now when you run for the presidency, that pair, it's going to see either P or VP next to your name, that you're designating that person you're voting for president and that person vice president, to clear up any of these misconceptions. But here is the main reason AP says that this is a new period in American history. The election of 1800, Jefferson says it is a revolution. What he is saying is that before his election, with the Federalists in charge, the Federalists were the party of the elite. The East Coast businessmen, well-educated, they were in control of the government. And now Jefferson says after 1800, after he takes office, it's going to be Democratic Republicans who are now in power. And they are the party of the common man. Weak central government, very little power to the government at all, and give it all back to the people. It's the age of democracy again. And so he says that that's why America is so different. In fact, he's saying that we are bringing the French Revolution to America. We are bringing the idea of the French Revolution to America, if not the guillotines. We are going to say that this is this election is the people rising up and taking power away from the elite and giving it back in the hands of the common man where it belongs. But was it a revolution? Just because Jefferson says it's a revolution and it's a sudden change in American history, is it really? If we look at this election map, we can see it's not so revolutionary, this election, because Jefferson barely wins. He gets 53% of the electoral vote as opposed to Adams's 47%. And so it's not that sudden of a change because most people obviously don't want it to be that much of a change. It's just barely being able to win the election. Next is we didn't see any kind of social revolution occur like we did in France. Oh, sure, politically we're going to be able to say how the common man now has power again. We're getting rid of the Federalists. But there is no blood in the streets, there's no guillotines, and so it isn't going to be a social revolution. Maybe political, but not social. And in fact, in a weird way, we can kind of think of it, it is revolutionary, but just not in the way Jefferson was saying. Jefferson was saying it's a revolution because the poor are going to rise up and take power from the elite. But we didn't really see that. We don't see the elite losing power. We don't see them losing their lives. But what kind of is revolutionary is very rarely in human history do you see one political party or group of people in power lose that power without any bloodshed. There is no demonstrating in the streets when the Federalists lose. There is no guillotines. There is no coup d'etats, government overthrows. The Federalists lose power and then quietly, calmly leave and hand it over to the Democratic Republicans. And that doesn't happen very much in world history. And so in a weird way, it is kind of revolutionary that we have a peaceful transfer of power. And this is going to set the stage for America for years to come, that when we have these peaceful elections and when the party in power loses, they calmly leave and let the new party take over. And that's something that is uniquely American and certainly is different than in other countries. So now we have a new president. Thomas Jefferson is the third president of the United States. So let's talk about his inauguration and his goals for America. So on Inauguration Day, all the previous presidents, both Washington and Adams, they went to their inauguration to be sworn in a coach and six, right? They had a coach that was all fancy. It had 6 horses. There was a big parade, a big ball, and we were celebrating bringing in this new president. Well, Jefferson says, look, I'm the party of the common man, and I want to let people know that I am not an elite. And so he lets it be symbolic that he walks to the White House in the muddy streets. There's no parade, there's no big inauguration ball, because he's saying, look, I am a common man, I'm just like you, and so I'm not going to put on those airs of all the elite who did before and have all this pomp and circumstance and parades and so forth. And so he's just going to be a common man in the White House. So we have this quote from Jefferson. He says, all eyes of the world are opened, or are opening to the rights of man. This is what he's saying about his election. The general spread of light and science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the masses of mankind, the common people, have not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to give them legitimacy by the grace of God. So we see from this quote here that's around the time of his inauguration that Jefferson believes that this is a revolution because the common people, the masses, throughout all of human history, they were born with a quote-unquote saddle on their back. They were ridden by the elite. The elite controlled the poor people's lives and told them what to do and had all the power. But Jefferson is saying now that the Democratic Republicans are elected, now that I'm elected, that is no longer going to be the case. The poor man have me to represent them, and I will make sure that we look out for the common man, the farmer in America. He also goes on to say in his speech, he asks for reconciliation. He says, look, I know this last election was pretty partisan. We said some things that we probably shouldn't have said. During Adams' presidency, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts, where one party tried to demolish another party by making it illegal to criticize the government. And so we've really been at each other's throats, as we see in this cartoon. And he says, now is the time to mend fences. Now is the time to realize that we are not Democratic Republicans. We're not Federalists, we're Americans. So let's all work together. And so in his inauguration speech, he famously says, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. What he's really trying to say is we're all Americans. Let's bury the hatchet, and let's have the parties actually work together for the benefit of America. So what does he do? If this is really a revolution of 1800 and the common men are going to be in charge, you would expect the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, to overturn all of the things the Federalists did. But he does not repeal the assumption of the debt at par. Remember, that was something that Hamilton did, and he did it to try to strengthen the federal government. The federal government would pay the states' debts, and in return, they would support the federal government. So if Jefferson is really trying to say that we should weaken the federal government, he should say to the states, look, pay your own debts back. And then the states would have no reason to support the federal government would get weaker. But he doesn't do that. Next, he does not get rid of the National Bank. The National Bank is something that's created by elites, for elites, to help promote business. Thomas Jefferson has said repeatedly before that he wants an America full of farmers. He doesn't want any businesses. So if that's the case, he should get rid of the National Bank because it doesn't help farmers, it just helps the elite, but he doesn't do that either. He also doesn't repeal the tariff. And again, the tariff was created by Hamilton to protect the elite, to force American middle class and lower class consumers to buy American made goods, to help American businessmen create their businesses and make them stronger. And so it helps the elite, the businessmen, but it doesn't help the common man. And if Jefferson really is for the common man, he should get rid of the tariff and the bank and make the federal government weaker. But he doesn't do any of these things. So is he really living up to his idea that this is a revolution for the common man? Not really. Once Jefferson is in power, we're going to find out that he kind of goes against his stated principles of small government, power to the people, increased democracy, strict construction. Once he has power, he understands that the government has to be strong if he is really going to be able to use it to do the things he'd like to do. He also doesn't get rid of all the Federalists. You would think he would get all of these rich elite Federalists from their government jobs in the United States government, but he doesn't. He keeps them in office. He keeps them to have their jobs. And so, again, the whole purpose of this slide is to talk about to what extent was the Revolution of 1800 really revolutionary. In many ways, as we can see, it's not. So what does Jefferson do? I just went through a list of the things that he doesn't change, but does he do anything? Does he try to roll back all the Federalist ideas and policies of the previous administration? He does a few things. He does help sign into law the Naturalization Law of 1802, which reduces the residency requirement to be a citizen from 14 years down to 5. If you remember, John Adams did that. He passed the Alien Act as a way of weakening the Democratic-Republican parties, taking members away from them because immigrants tended to be Democratic-Republicans. And so now we see this is a victory for the common man. Now this immigrant who comes to America who's poor, he can become a citizen and vote in 5 years instead of waiting for 14. Next, he gets rid of the excise tax on whiskey. Jefferson knew that was very unpopular with farmers. The farmers didn't want to pay this whiskey tax, and it was really only taking from the poor and putting that money in the national bank to help the rich. And so Jefferson gets rid of the excise tax on whiskey, making him very popular with farmers. He's looking out for the common man, the farmer. And so then we see this quote here. Why does Jefferson like the farmer so much? He says, "Those who labor in the earth, farmers, are the chosen people of God, if he ever had a chosen people, whose breast has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." So let's take a moment to talk about why Jefferson likes farmers so much. He's calling them God's chosen people. It's because he believes that the only way to have democracy in America is to have small, independent farmers. You see, if we have a nation full of city dwellers and we have companies, we're going to have a nation full of rich elite men who own businesses with thousands of smaller, lesser men who have less money that work for them. So on election day, what could happen is the boss takes all of his employees to the voting booth, the ballot box, and he says, "I want you all to vote for this man, and if you don't, I'm going to fire all of you." And Jefferson is afraid that will happen, and he says that we can't have that. That's not how you have democracy. So the only way to have truly independent voters, who nobody controls their votes, is to have a nation full of small farmers who own their own farms, and nobody can tell them on election day who to vote for. That's why he wants an America full of small independent farmers and not cities, not businessmen. He also does reduce the national debt. Jefferson believes that the debt is a way of one generation to tyrannize the next generation. Just think about me and your parents. We, throughout our lives, have benefited from the government being strong and powerful and providing all kinds of a strong military and services to the poor. So we've racked up a large debt to pay for all of those things. But when I die, or when your parents die, and you're an adult, you're going to be saddled with this huge debt that you're not responsible for, that my generation did, but you have to pay for. And so Jefferson believed that the debt is a way from one generation to tyrannize another, and that's not very democratic. And so he's trying to look out for the common man in the future, that they should not have to worry about paying off a debt that future generations incurred. The next thing, and this is a very important slide, and it's kind of hard to understand, so we'll go through a little bit slow, is that right before Jefferson took office, as the Federalists and John Adams were leaving Washington, D.C., they were afraid that Jefferson would make all these radical changes. And so what they did is they kind of did a dirty trick. They appointed 16 federal judges right before they left office. These are the famous midnight judges. These 16 judges, they are going to be Federalist judges, and they're going to make sure that we protect all of the Federalist ideas and laws that were passed while the Federalists in power. And so they're going to promote business, they're going to promote strong national government, and this is going to be something that Thomas Jefferson has to struggle with, right? The Federalists lost the election, but just to make sure they didn't lose America, they're going to put these judges in because remember, these judges serve for life. They will never go away until they die in maybe 20, 30 years. And so this was the way, these midnight judges were a way for the Federalists to maintain their power in the government long after they've lost control of Congress and the presidency. The most famous of these federal judges is a guy by the name of John Marshall. Pictured here, he is going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and for 20 plus years, he is going to frustrate the Democratic Republicans. As the Democratic Republicans try to do things to weaken the federal government, to promote farmers, John Marshall, who is a Federalist, he is going to stop it again and again and again through the courts, because he is the Chief Justice of the United States, and he's going to make sure that we promote business and protect the elite. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the case of Marbury versus Madison. So here's Jefferson trying to get rid of some of these midnight judges. He just doesn't want to deal with them. And so on the right-hand side, we see a picture of James Madison. He is the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, and he tells him to go fire Mr. Marbury, who we see in the middle here. Marbury is one of these midnight judges. He is a Federalist judge. And so Madison goes to Marbury and he says, look, you're fired. We know the Federalists hired you, but we don't want to have to deal with you anymore, so you're done. Of course, Marbury says, well, according to the Constitution, I'm a federal judge, I serve for life, and you can't fire me. And so they have this disagreement. It becomes a court case known as Marbury versus Madison. Now, the important part about this case is that John Marshall decides to take the case. He sees this court case being played out in a lower court, and he says, no, the Supreme Court is going to decide on this case, so he takes the case. And that is what is really shocking and radical. Not who the court rules for, Marbury or Madison, but it's the fact that he actually took the case to begin with. Because this is the first time that the Supreme Court has said they have the power to take over cases in lower courts and rule if they're constitutional or not. It's called the power of judicial review, and this is going to transform the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, according to this case, has the right to decide if acts or laws by the Congress or the President of the United States are constitutional, are allowed. And it sets them up really as the final authority in our government. And so what we see here is through the court case of Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court has assumed the power of judicial review, which means they are the supreme law of the land. They get to decide once and final if anything is legal or not legal, constitutional or not constitutional. And this gives that branch of government way more power. The reason I wrote oops here is because Thomas Jefferson did not intend this to happen. When he wanted Madison to fire Marbury, he was just trying to get rid of a judge he didn't like. But unintentionally, what it does is it's going to strengthen the federal government, specifically the United States court system, the Supreme Court. And so that's ironic because Jefferson wants to weaken this control of the federal government. But through his actions, unbeknownst to him, it would work out in the future that it actually made the Supreme Court stronger. Next, we have the case of Justice Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase is another one of these midnight judges. He is a Federalist judge. And his problem is that he's very outspoken in his dislike of the Democratic Republicans, and he won't shut up about it. And he's just a thorn in Jefferson's side. And so Jefferson says, fine, if I can't fire justices outright, what I will do is I'll fire them through impeachment. That seems to be constitutional. Because in the Constitution, it does say that you can fire judges. It does say that you can impeach judges. But it does also say in the Constitution that the only way to get rid of a judge is if they have committed a high crime or misdemeanor. And so Jefferson says, look, we're going to get rid of this guy, and his crime is that we just don't like his politics. He's outspoken, he's a loudmouth, and he is a Federalist who's always criticizing the Democratic Republicans, so let's get rid of him. And so the case goes through, and of course the Supreme Court says that you can't do this. You cannot fire a judge just because you don't like his politics. He actually has to commit a crime. The reason this is important is because it's going to create what is known as the independent judiciary. It says that we are going to have judges in America that should be free to follow their conscience. If we didn't have an independent judiciary, if we went ahead and let Samuel Chase be fired, then judges would always be worried when they make a decision about whether a decision is popular or not. And Marshall is saying we don't want judges to have to worry about if something is popular. We want them to make decisions in their court cases based on something is right and constitutional, not if it's popular. That's the way to interpret law. And so what we see here is now the Supreme Court and all federal judges are independent. Once you hire them, you can't fire them unless they commit a crime. So even if you don't like their politics, that's too bad. They are free for the rest of their life to make decisions based on what they feel is right, what they personally like, and what they think is constitutional, not what is popular at the time. Next, Jefferson is going to reduce the military. Again, Jefferson says that he is against a strong government because a strong government will take away people's rights. So Jefferson does not like a large military, a standing army, a permanent army. He says throughout history, if you look back in time, governments, kings, rulers have used their military to oppress their own people way more than they've done to protect the country. And so he reduces the military down to 2,500 men. He does this, again, because he thinks the military will be used to oppress the people. Now, that is a very small military, and we'll find out later on that this is a mistake as we get ready for the War of 1812. We're not going to have a very strong army. So we see this famous quote here by Jefferson. He says, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. It is a medicine, revolutions, necessary for the sound health of the government." He publicly goes on record to say that every generation they should rebel against the government and replace it with a new government. He is all for the common man having control of the government. And if there's always a threat of rebellion, the government will always do what the people say. But they can't do this if they have a strong federal army to overcome. And so we see Jefferson is somewhat of a radical here, saying that we should have constant civil wars in America to get rid of any oppressive government. He is really for power to the people. He also reduces the Navy. He doesn't believe we need a large Navy because you have to have taxes to support that, and that hurts the common man. So he reduces the Navy, he gets rid of our Navy, and he basically just leaves a Coast Guard to protect our shores. He said, look, the only people the Navy are protecting are those rich merchants, and if they want to have somebody protect them, then they should pay for it themselves. So let's make the federal government smaller and weaker. Next, we go on to one of the most important events in Jefferson's administration. It's the Louisiana Purchase, and you should know the date, 1803. So our story starts with Napoleon. Napoleon is in Europe, and he is in the process of conquering Europe. Now, to do that, he needs lots of money. So where is Napoleon going to get the money to pay for all his weapons and his conquests? And the answer is simple. He is going to use his sugar islands in the Caribbean, specifically Haiti. They're going to grow sugar, and then he's going to sell this sugar for huge profits to pay for his conquest. But the problem he has is that Haiti, we use all the land in Haiti to grow sugar, but nothing for food, and he needs to feed those slaves in Haiti. And so, as we see on the bottom map, that green area, that's Louisiana. That's all controlled by France. And Napoleon's plan is he's going to use the land in Louisiana to grow enough food to feed his slaves in Haiti so they can grow crops, grow sugar, so he can finance his wars. And so that's how Louisiana kind of fits into Napoleon's scheme of world domination. Next, the French also want to hold on to Louisiana because they're afraid that the United States one day is going to become too strong, and so they don't want the United States to move west. And so if we hold on to Louisiana, we can check Western American expansion. In addition, we don't want the English to get Louisiana because that would make them stronger too, and Napoleon hates both the United States and England, but especially England. Next. So Jefferson, so let's go back to the slide just a second. And at the very bottom of Louisiana, we see this part that sticks out in green, and that is modern day Louisiana, and that's where New Orleans is located. Now, New Orleans has a very strategic location. It is the entry point to get up the Mississippi River to the whole Louisiana territory, and in fact, the Ohio River Valley too. And the United States desperately wants New Orleans. Because it is what Western farmers use in Kentucky and Tennessee to get their crops to market. And so Jefferson sends James Monroe to France. James Monroe is a friend of his, he's a fellow Virginian, and he is going to offer the government of France $10 million just to buy the city of New Orleans. And I talked about how important it is as a strategic place for American trade. Now, this is interesting because Jefferson has always said that he wants the federal government to be weaker, and so he believes in strict construction, only doing what the Constitution allows the government to do, specifically stated in the Constitution. But the problem is nowhere in the Constitution does it say the president can authorize us to buy chunks of land or cities. And so Jefferson, what he has to do is he has to kind of be flexible on his own morals. He has to go ahead and employ some loose construction. He says, just because the Constitution doesn't say I can do it, doesn't mean I can't do it. And so we see Jefferson, again, once he's in office, he is starting to go away from his ideas of strict construction and start to employ loose construction so he can buy New Orleans. Weirdly, the Federalists don't want him to do this. Remember, the Federalists have always said that they want to be loose construction, let the government be strong and big and do what they need to do. But now that the Federalists are out of party, they don't like Jefferson increasing the size of America. They don't want Jefferson to be strong and powerful, to be successful. And so since the Federalists are out of party, they start championing the right of strict construction. They now say, well, we believe in strict construction because it never says that the Jefferson or the president can do this. And so here's the weird thing, right? We see once the political parties in the past, when the Federalists were in power, they were for strong government and for loose construction. But now they're out of power, and so now they're for strict construction and weak government. And then the opposite is true of the Democratic Republicans. So this is a change in these political parties that you might see on an essay question. Next, Napoleon decides to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. Now, he doesn't really like the United States, but the problem is his slaves that he has in Haiti, they have overthrown the government of France in Haiti. We have this man named Toussaint Louverture, and he is going to lead a slave rebellion in Haiti, and they're going to overthrow the French and make it free from French control. And so there is no reason to hold on to Louisiana. Napoleon wanted Louisiana so he could grow crops to feed his slaves, to produce sugar so he could buy weapons. But now he doesn't have Haiti, and he doesn't have any slaves because they rebelled. And so Louisiana is just sitting there, and it's a big nothing for him, and he desperately needs money. And so as the United States comes, as James Monroe comes, and we say, look, we'll give you $10 million to buy New Orleans, he says, how about I give you all of Louisiana for $15 million? So I'll throw in New Orleans and just the whole Louisiana territory for a $5 million more. So this is a pretty sweet deal for the United States. And of course, we're going to jump at it. We're going to buy not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson, he struggles a little bit. He's like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I should do this. Strictly speaking, I'm not supposed to do this according to the Constitution. I'm supposed to be a strict constructionist, but what the heck, right? This would be great for farmers if they had all of this land. It would be great for farmers if we had New Orleans. So I'll go ahead and do it. I'll buy the whole thing for $15 million. So let's talk about the impact of Louisiana Purchase on the United States. It is going to, in a very simple way, it's going to double the size of the United States. So that has a huge impact on us. So now we're expanding westward. It also is going to make Jefferson tremendously popular with farmers because as it comes out, if we take $15 million and divide it by the amount of acres that are in Louisiana Purchase, it comes out to about 3 cents an acre. So farmers know for years to come they're going to have access to cheap, available land, and farmers love available land, so they just love Thomas Jefferson for doing this. Next, Jefferson decides to go ahead and send out some explorers to figure out what we purchased. We kind of bought Louisiana sight unseen. And so he sends out Zebulon Pike to explore the southern part of Louisiana Purchase. And you can see on the map, it's in black, and he's going to go kind of to where Colorado is to make a big loop, go down into Mexico, and then eventually back to the Mississippi. The reason he takes that kind of circuitous route is that we don't know exactly where Louisiana's borders are. Of course, here in Colorado, he is famous for naming Pikes Peak. He gets to Colorado, he sees this far-off peak, he goes, wow, that's really big, I should totally name it for myself, because I'm a shy guy. And so then, he names it, and then he moves on. Now, for the northern part of Louisiana Territory, we send, of course, Lewis and Clark to go explore. They take several men with them, and they're going to go up the Missouri River. You can see their route on red in this map. And he's going to go up the Missouri River, and they're looking for two things. Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark to find two things. Their whole mission is, one, to find the Northwest Passage. We're still looking for some waterway that'll get us through the American continent to China. And then two, Lewis and Clark are supposed to keep a record and collect samples of all the flora and fauna that they find on the route. It's kind of supposed to be a how-to menu for future settlers and farmers so that they know what plants are good, what animals you can use to kill and survive on. Are the Native Americans friendly or not? And so that's what they're supposed to do, keep a record of their journey. Famously, Lewis and Clark bring a French fur trapper, Coeur des Bois, on the journey with them to help translate and guide them. And this French coureur des bois' wife is Sacagawea or Sacagawea, and you see her pictured here. And she helps to be their guide along the way. Now, as they do go all the way up the Missouri, and they don't find the Northwest Passage, of course, because the Rocky Mountains block us, the United States, from the Pacific Ocean. And so they get to the end of the Missouri River, and they have to go over the Rocky Mountains, and then they find another river, the Columbia, and that takes them down the coast all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so they find out, oh my gosh, we just failed. We couldn't find the Northwest Passage, but we did get the Pacific Ocean. So all this area in purple here, that's called the Oregon Territory, and the United States now has a claim to that land because Lewis and Clark explored there. So for a couple of weeks, Lewis and Clark hang out on the beach. They're waiting for some maybe British fishing ship to find them, and they can take the take the ship back to America, but it doesn't. They're not there, and so they have to get back on their boats, and they climb back up the Columbia River. They cross the Rocky Mountains again, and this time they go down the Missouri River and eventually go all the way back to Washington, D.C. So it takes them about a 2-year round trip, and they go back to Thomas Jefferson, and he says, okay, what'd you find? And they said, wow, America's really big. We found some new areas west of the Rocky Mountains. And he goes, great. Did you find the Northwest Passage? Like, well, no, it doesn't exist as far as we can find. And so they're kind of a failure. He says, okay, don't worry about it. Can I see all the samples of all the plants and animals in your diaries that you brought back from your trip? I'm like, well, funny thing, we kind of lost most of that too. Our boat got capsized in some rapids, and so we just have some to show you, but not very much. And so they felt like they were a failure. And so we see that the Lewis and Clark expedition at the time, people thought, well, that wasn't very successful. But as we look back on it, it gave us a good idea of what's out there. Plus, we have now claimed the Oregon Territory. Jefferson's second term. So we have the election of 1804. It's not an election to know, right? The election of 1800 is the revolution of 1800. We see a change in political parties. It's the success for the common man. But in 1804, there's never a question that Jefferson is going to win re-election. His first term is very popular. Farmers love him. He gave them the Louisiana Purchase, so they get cheap land. And we also see that the economy is really good for farmers. Europe, as we've talked about, is at war. Napoleon's conquering Europe. And so everybody in Europe needs food, American food. And so farmers in America are doing great. Everybody is buying their crops, which means they have high prices for their crops. In addition to that, the Federalists are not very strong to oppose Jefferson. The Federalist Party is crumbling. The leader of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton, he's no longer alive. He was killed in a duel with Thomas Jefferson's vice president, which is a weird thing to think of the vice president, Aaron Burr, shooting somebody while he's vice president. But he does. He has a duel with Alexander Hamilton, and he kills him. So without their leader, Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Party is quickly weakening, which makes it easy for Jefferson to get reelected. If we look at this election map, we see Jefferson has a landslide victory. Even the Northeast, the stronghold of the Federalist Party, they only get Connecticut. And so we're not ready to kill off the Federalist Party, but soon. They're weakening quickly. So now we're into Jefferson's second term, and so let's see what kind of problems he faced. And he's going to have a really tough time in his second term, and it's all going to be devoted to war. Napoleon has really conquered most of Europe by this point. And so there's not a lot of left for him to conquer. He'd like to conquer Great Britain, but we have this kind of stalemate going on in Europe. France reigns supreme on the continent. They have the best army. But England reigns supreme on the seas. They have the best navy, and so the war is just dragging on. Now, the United States, of course, is trading with both sides. We're trading food for the French and food for the British, and we're making a ton of money. But just like during the presidency of George Washington, England gets mad. They say, United States, if you would stop selling the French food, maybe we could end this war. And the United States says, hey, what are you worried about? We're selling you food to you too. And England says, I know, but you're selling food to our enemies, which is feeding them, which is allowing them to continue to fight. So we need you to stop selling food to the French. We say, you can't tell us what to do. We're America. We can sell food or whatever to whoever we want. And so England, just like they did during the presidency of George Washington, they start harassing American ships. They start to seize our ships. They start to impress our sailors. And the most famous example of this is the Leopard incident, sometimes called the Chesapeake incident. We have this British warship, the Leopard, and they are going to start harassing American ships, and one of them is a United States ship, a Navy ship called the Chesapeake. They pull over the ship, the U.S. Navy ship, the Chesapeake, and they say, under threat of sinking it, we think you have some sailors from the British Navy on your ship. And the Americans say, look, you can't do this. We're Americans. We're an independent nation. You can't just pull us over, and you can't take sailors off of our ship claiming that they're runaway sailors from the British Navy. But the British do it anyway, and Americans are humiliated. How dare the British abduct American sailors off of American ships? That's an act of war. And so we see Americans start to demand war with the British. Now, just like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson knows that we are not ready for war with the British, especially after he destroyed our Navy, and he decreased our army. And so Jefferson is desperate to find a way to avoid war with the British. We see this very famous political cartoon here where Thomas Jefferson is in the middle, he has his hands up, and he's letting Napoleon on the right and the English on the left just rob us blind, seize our ships, take our sailors, steal our goods, and he's doing nothing about it. So obviously this is a Federalist cartoon criticizing Thomas Jefferson's inaction. So what does Jefferson do? He's not going to just sit around and do nothing. And so what he decides to do is to launch his famous embargo. It lasts from 1807 to 1809. It's at the end of his second term. And his goal is to avoid war with the British. And he reasons, look, the more we try to trade at all in the ocean, the more the English are going to harass our ships. The more they harass our ships, the more there is a call for war in America. So the solution is to keep all of the American ships locked up in harbor. We're going to embargo or not sell anything to anybody in Europe, because everybody in Europe is involved in this war. So he's trying to avoid having America get sucked into this European conflict by just not trading with anybody. Of course, this is a dumb idea. One, because it is going against his principles of a small, weak, national federal government. He has said that the government should be small and weak, and really all the states should have power. But this is a huge expansion of the federal government's power, because now the federal government has said to all the states, you can't trade with anybody in Europe. That's increasing the federal government's power. So once again, Jefferson is kind of going contrary to his beliefs of weak government. Next, the Federalists are going to be the ones that are hurt the most from this. The part of America that trades the most with England is the Northeast, those merchants. And he had just cut their trade off with Mother England. And so this is going to cause economic ruin for the northeastern part of the United States. And all those Federalists, they see a conspiracy here. They think that Jefferson, more than just wanting to avoid war, he's trying to punish them for their opposition to him. And so they think that Jefferson is just this horrible politician who's not trying to protect America. He's just trying to punish his political opponents. Next, we see, and perhaps the most important thing you should get out of the embargo, is it destroys the United States economy. Not just those merchants up north, but even farmers in America, they were trading and making lots of money by trading with the French and the British and whoever, and now we're not trading with anybody. And so America goes into a severe depression. We're not trading with anybody. We can see it in this famous picture here. The two guys in the foreground, they're merchants, and they're trying to take their barrels to the British ship off the coast so we can make some money. And so it says, damn it, how he nicks them. And then the other merchant is saying, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. So what is grabbing him, stopping him from trading with the British is this turtle. And of course, the turtle represents the embargo. Jefferson's not letting us trade with anybody. And if you read the cartoon, if you look at oh, grab me, backwards it spells embargo. And so this is a Federalist cartoon protesting Jefferson's use of the embargo because it's hurting our economy. And this is not something we should be doing. We should not be hurting our economy just to avoid the war. Ironically, is that, remember, Jefferson wanted to create a nation full of farmers. The weird thing is, though, is when he embargoes Europe and he says we're not going to trade with them, well, Americans still need tools. Americans still need shoes and dresses. And if we can't get it from Europe, well, then we see Americans start to make their own goods. And so oddly enough, manufacturing increases, so does urbanization, the very things Jefferson wanted to avoid. So this is kind of an unintended consequence of his embargo. Eventually, this embargo is so unpopular and it hurts the economy so much that by the end of his presidency, Jefferson is forced to repeal or get rid of the embargo. But he still doesn't want to go to war with England. So how can we increase trade, but avoid war with England. And so what he comes up with is this new piece of legislation called the Non-Intercourse Act. The Non-Intercourse Act means we're not going to trade with anybody, but especially England and France. And so the difference between the embargo and the Non-Intercourse Act, the embargo passed in 1807 says we're not going to trade with anybody in Europe, destroying our economy. So a compromise is the Non-Intercourse Act, and it says, okay, we're going to trade with Europe, but just not England and France. They're the two people that are the main combatants in the war, and if we don't trade with them, maybe we can avoid war, but we can trade with Portugal and Spain and Italy, and maybe that's okay. It'll help us our economy a little bit. It doesn't. It doesn't work because our number 1 and 2 trading partner are England and France, so this really doesn't help the economy at all. And so that's the end of this lecture.